Hello and welcome to Prayer House Chickrell during lockdown, and I thought it would be good to have a chat about making decisions. So I think there's a lot to learn from Saul about making decisions. He wasn't very good at it, and I think it's useful to have a look at why he wasn't very good at it and how we can be better at making decisions. Now, a lot of people think that making decisions is all about having the right outcome, but it's not. Making a good decision it's about wisdom. It's about thinking about how best to achieve what you want to achieve. But also it's deeper than that. You've got to weigh up a lot more than just what you want to achieve. And maybe you're trying to make a decision at the moment, or maybe you're not. But even if you're not, it's good to think about these things, because preparing your heart, preparing your mind, considering the right things and having the right things in your character all go towards helping you make decisions. So I want to read a bit from 1 Samuel, and I'm going to start reading at verse 24. 1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 24. So a little bit of background. Saul is fighting. They're at war, and then Saul is hanging back a lot, and Jonathan goes out trusting God, and he does something which may seem rash, but actually he is looking for signs from God the whole time. Basically, him and his armor bearer go up alone against the Philistines, and then they score a great victory, and then the Philistines are on the back foot, and this is where Saul comes in, and he starts trying to then defeat the Philistines. And so the Philistines are fleeing, and the battle is moving, and Saul wants to press the advantage. And this is where we get to it on verse 24. And it says this: "And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day, so Saul laid an oath on the people, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies.'" So none of the people had tasted food. So what's happening here? Saul wants to press on, and he wants to gain an advantage, and he makes a decision, and he swears an oath, and he's doing something very, very serious here. So he is pinning his whole reputation on this thing at that point, that the people of Israel are not to eat. As "Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies." Now, the issue, of course, is that it's quite a rash thing to say when you're at war and fighting. Yeah, like we do it every day. When you're doing physical activities, you need to take in fuel, otherwise, well, you run into problems, and there's all sorts of issues. I like cycling, and in cycling, it's called, if you run out of fuel and you're on a long ride, it's called the bonk. And what happens is you cycle along, you feel great, and all of a sudden it's like someone's bonked you on the head, and you lose all your momentum and all your strength, and you basically are crawling at that point. It's all you can do just to turn your pedals. And in fact, it can make you ill. I went cycling once with my youngest brother, Michael, and I don't know what he'd been doing. I think he'd been up late, and then got up in the morning, realised he was running late for the cycle ride, and went out without any breakfast. And he was really struggling, and we were cycling off, and he was lagging behind, and we got to this particular corner, and he had to stop. He threw up on the road. He was not feeling well at all, and we had to phone up someone to go and pick him up. So, and we still remember that corner every time we go past it. That was the corner where Uncle Michael had to stop his cycle ride. But running low on fuel is a serious thing. So Saul is doing something. He's trying to press the advantage, but he makes a decision which is not to the benefit of his men, and unfortunately not everyone hears about it, and this is what happens next. Okay, so let's read on. So verse 25, now when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. Now honey is great fuel. Okay, if you're exercising and you want to take in something which is going to perk you up, honey is great. Now again, cycling. When I was cycling with Rod Fowler, and he would get some honeycomb. He'd put it between two bits of foil and stick it in his back pocket. And I thought that's a bit sticky, but then I tried it. You basically, while you're riding, you peel it off and you kind of like eat it in your mouth and you chew up the honeycomb. But it gives you so much strength. It's just pure sugar, and at that point there, you're lifted, you've got energy, and so what happens next? So if they find honey, where were we? And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath, so he put out the tip of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put it to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. But basically what happens then is people say, Jonathan, what have you done? Your dad said don't eat the honey. And Jonathan says, well, my dad is being daft, because look at me, I was failing, my arms were heavy. Bearing in mind that Jonathan has been fighting longer than anybody. He went out there as armor bearer and doing great things. And he says, what a stupid thing my dad has said. And so you see, the first outcome of making a rash decision here is that people start criticizing the person who's made the decision. Now, I'm not going to pretend that making a right decision means that no one's going to criticize you. That's not. People are going to criticize. But here, Jonathan is criticizing his own father in front of all the men, and he's led to do that because his father has done something rash. So you can avoid a lot of criticism by making a sound decision. Then what happens is that the people are so hungry that they start, when it's gone on for quite a while, in verse 32, they start eating whatever they can find as polluted food. They shouldn't be doing it. People are all sinning at this point. And Saul is at that point forced to just allow the people to eat and organise something, because clearly the people are just picking up whatever they can eat and eating that. Meat with the blood still in this is a terrible thing for a Jew to do. So Saul says, all right, let's organise something. And at that point, he's backtracking. He's made a bad decision, and he is seeing the outcome of it, and he's backtracking. He's having to go back and do something. Now, when you make a decision, you'll often find that you then have to alter what you've said. But what Saul did was he pinned his whole reputation on that decision. Instead of saying to people, let's not stop for a break yet, let's keep pushing on, he said, cursed is the person who doesn't eat food until the evening. He set hard limits on it. He's basically said that he's going to judge anyone who eats. And he's not thinking of the people. So he set these hard limits, and now he's having to go back on these hard limits. He didn't have to set those limits. And so in verse 37, you find that God is not speaking to Saul now. It's going from bad to worse. The people are breaking loose. God's not talking to Saul. Saul blames Jonathan for this, because he finds that Jonathan has eaten honey. And then he's going to kill Jonathan. But the people rally behind Jonathan and say, no, we're not going to allow you to do that. So you can read that in verse 45. Then the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die who has worked this great salvation in Israel. Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall on the ground. You see, the people there are now making their own vows against Saul. As the Lord lives, there shall not be one hair of his head that falls to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. And then it says, so the people ransomed Jonathan. So if you're going to start making hard and fast boundaries, and people are you're inviting people just to break it, you're inviting people to push hard back against you, you're setting yourself up for a fall. And it's very, very chaotic, and it's all because his actions are ill thought out. He's not thinking right. He's not thinking right. So how do we think right about decisions? Things are always going to go wrong, and there's always going to be pressures that we meet. But how is it in our hearts we can avoid situations like that? So I want to have a look at what Saul's character's like, and what we should be doing instead. So Saul was someone who feared men more than God. He's someone who thought more about what other people thought about him than what God thought about him. And this really dictates his life. He's got quite a thing going on in his head about how small he is, about how insignificant he is, and this quirk inside him works against him, because he's forever trying to prove how big he is and how important he is. And so this is one thing that is leading him to rash decisions. If you think about what other people think of you all the time, then everything you say is to try and impress them. But actually, you've got to stop and say, no, I'm not going to do that. And say, I want to impress God. Fear of man versus fear of God. And so if you're thinking about, how do I do the thing that would please God, that would impress God here, you're starting to think about the character of God. Instead of thinking about the character of man, what would it take to impress men, you're saying, how do I impress God? And very quickly your heart will start moving away from making rash decisions, because you'll realise that making a rash decision for someone who understands everything is not going to please him. But what does please God? So faith pleases God. You're going to start doing things in faith. You're going to start doing things, you'll be looking for what God is saying to you. You're going to be listening to him and involving him in any decisions. And that's really important. When you're thinking about what to do, pray. It's okay to pray. In fact, it's necessary. Pray to God, what do I do? And keep working through what the decision you're trying to make, praying about it. And you're going to be thinking about God's will, and you're going to start thinking about other people. So not in the way that you're trying to impress them, but you're trying to think about how to benefit them. So Saul was not trying to benefit his people, he was just trying to press forward, and he was trying to force them into pressing forward by coming up with these very serious vows and pinning his reputation on things. And if he'd been fearing God, he'd been looking at his men and thinking about his men. Now, how does that work? Well, if you are looking to God for your decisions, then spiritually it's a good thing, your heart is going to be in a better place. But also remember that God loves the people around you. He wants you to serve them, he wants you to help them. And so you're going to start thinking about how you help the people around you. And the opposite is true if you think about impressing people, because if you're looking at impressing people, you're going to split the world into the people who matter and the people who don't matter. The people who matter are the people you're trying to impress, and the people who don't matter are the people that you do not want to impress. And you see this in every single sort of like high school type film that comes out of Hollywood is that there's the people who are the in crowd and the people who are not in the in crowd, and quite often the protagonist will try to be impressing the people in the in crowd because they think they matter, when actually the people who are not in the in crowd matter most, matter just as much. And there's a big moral story there about not looking down on people, and that's what happens if you love God. You start looking at people all the same, which is people whom God loves, and that is going to feed into your decisions. Love God, you'll be loving people, and you'll be looking out for them. So you'll also be looking at what is right and wrong. So some decisions you make, you might be thinking to yourself, I could do this, I could say a little white lie, I could admit the truth, and it would go a lot easier for me here. But you'll be actually, when you're trying to impress God, you'll be looking at more what's right and wrong, and you'll be doing things which aren't necessarily to your benefit, and people will notice this. King David was someone who he was quite an emotional guy. He made sort of like quick decisions, but they were rooted in something that was quite important. They were rooted in God, and so he would make a quick decision, but actually people would be look at it and be impressed. And when he did sin, when he did go wrong, he was very, very open about it. So he had a very strong understanding of right and wrong, and so he would do things which weren't to his benefit just because he felt it's the right thing to do, and that gained him a lot of respect. And people have a lot of respect for David for what he did after his most catastrophic sin, where he committed adultery. He took another man's wife and slept with her, and she got pregnant, and he ended up having the husband killed, and it was terrible, and God knew. And the prophet Nathan came to him and pointed out what he'd done wrong, and at which point it all comes flooding out of David, and he has been chewing up on the inside, and he confesses his sin, and he repents, and he even writes psalms about it. I mean, who does that? Who writes songs and publishes them about the most terrible things you've done wrong in your life? But he did, and he glorified God in them, and people have a lot of respect for him for that. So if you are someone who fears God, you'll think a lot about right and wrong, because you know that God thinks a lot about right and wrong. But if you fear men, then what's going to be happening is that you're not going to be thinking about what's right and what's wrong. You're going to be thinking about how to impress people, and you're going to be thinking about outcome. So you're going to be saying to yourself, how best do I achieve the outcome that I want? Now clearly when you're making a decision, you need to think about outcome. You need to think, what is the best way of achieving what I want to achieve? But if that becomes your overriding consideration, then what's going to happen is that you're going to do things which are morally dubious, because you're looking at outcome as being more important than anything else. So if you think about famous sports stars who have fallen, Lance Armstrong, very, very famous cyclist, he was racing into quite late in his quite old, and he was winning races, but it turned out that not all of him was as old as it seemed. He had blood doping, so he'd take some blood out and store it in the fridge when he hadn't been doing a lot of exercise, so the blood was full of oxygen and full of fuel, and then he'd ride in the Tour de France, and of course that's many days, and so in the evening he would plug himself into this blood supply, and he'd take in some oxygenated, fueled up blood, and he was cheating. He was cheating because he was looking at outcome. That's what he wanted. He wanted to win. There was nothing else that mattered. You think about politicians, the ones which look at outcome and they fall over, and everyone derides them at that point because they wanted to win, and then they went wrong. Or corporations. So when we look at, quite often when people are criticising the way that capitalism works, what they're criticising isn't so much the way it works, but the way that people treat it. So people are too geared towards outcome. Outcome is important, but if that's the overriding thing in your life, you're going to go seriously wrong. And so what happens then when your decisions fail? Because whether you do something for the right reason or the wrong reason, it's still got the possibility that it's going to go wrong. We're going to experience that in life. And if you fear men and you've been doing things based on outcome and your decision fails, you are going to regret that decision very, very, very deeply. It's going to eat up into you because actually you sinned and you've done something which was morally questionable. Even if the only sin you did was not to consider God in your plans, it's still a sin, and that's why it eats into us, and this deep, deep regret can build up because if we do things for the wrong reasons and it goes wrong, then we can suffer from a deep, deep regret. Now, clearly, regret can come from other situations as well, but that is one of the risks you're taking by making a decision based on the wrong thing. So regret and chewing it up and feelings of failure and disaster go hand in hand with making decisions for the wrong reason. And I want to say clearly that you can feel those things and it not be because of a bad decision. But I want to say that if you're making decisions for the wrong reasons, you're exposing yourself to this. So what happens if you fail and you've done everything for the right reason? So what if you fail at doing something and you're doing it to try and benefit others, and you're thinking about God's will and you've been praying about it and you've been looking at right versus wrong and you're completely at ease with this decision because you've made it for the right reasons and it all goes wrong? Well, you're going to feel a bit of failure, you're going to feel disappointment, but you're going to be protected from it eating up into your heart. It's going to be something which you're sad about, but you're able to move on from fairly easily. Because in trusting God, you're trusting God in the good times and the bad times. And you're trusting God when it's gone wrong as well as when it's going right. And what will you be doing when it goes wrong? Well, look at the Psalms. If your heart's in the right place, your heart's going to be like one of those Psalms which is crying out to God and saying, this is going badly. And then it finishes with, but I'm going to trust you, and all my hope and my joy and everything comes from you. And that is what's going to be going on in your heart. When you face failure, turn to God. Cry out your heart to Him. And it's okay to do that. In fact, God wants us to do that. Job famously complains to God and says, I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you doing this to me? Why have you abandoned me? Why are you treating me unjustly? Why? And Job's is all pouring out of Job's heart. And at the end of Job, God criticizes his friends who said, well, surely you've done something wrong, Job, because that's why God is punishing you. And he criticizes them and says, you spoke wrongly. And he says about Job, basically, that he spoke rightly. I'll think about that for a minute. Job complained. Job griped. Job cried out. Job said that God was treating him unjustly. All these things came out of Job's mouth. But God said, no, he was speaking rightly. It's okay to pour out your heart to God. It's okay to say to him, why is this happening to me? It's okay. Well, what happened to Job when he did that? God met with him and revealed things to him and filled his heart with wonder. He didn't actually explain why the things that Job had suffered had happened. He didn't do that, but he did bless him. And so turn to God. Don't be afraid to cry out to him when things go wrong. So here you go. I've tried to give you a platform for making decisions, and it's all to do with character, and it's all to do with your perspective on God. So have a search around in your heart, have a rummage around inside, and spend some time praying, and spend some time worshipping and doing all those things. These things will help you make good decisions because you're turning your mind towards God. And if you're actually facing a decision now, then don't be afraid of it going wrong. I mean, that may happen whether you're afraid or not, but you've got to be concerned about today, not about tomorrow. So what you've got to do is you've got to trust God. You've got to pray to him. You've got to seek his will. You've got to think about the other people in your life, and then you've got to come to a decision. And you may or may not feel that you're certain this is the right decision. It doesn't matter. The fact is that if you're doing it in faith, if you're doing it trusting God, if you're doing it from the right heart, even if it all goes horribly wrong, that is a path that God is leading you through. That is a path that God is leading you through. So trust God and you'll make good decisions. Don't trust God and you'll stumble and fall, and God won't be there to pick you up. But even if you stumble and fall, if you love God, he will pick you up. And so you can trust him. So that's what I've got to say. So let's finish with a prayer and say, Father in heaven, we trust you, we love you, and please guide us by your Spirit and by your heavenly wisdom when we come to making decisions. Amen.